When it comes to detection, of course I have to put the pitch in here that says you want to buy an Agrosera antibody, of course. But the key is to match your antibody concentration to your detection system and to the load of protein that you put on the blot in the first place. You have to have more primary antibody there than you have target molecules on the blot, because it won't be quantitative unless you're in an excess antibody situation. And that doesn't really matter if you're doing pretty picture antibodies, but if you're doing quantitative immunoblotting, then you really have to have an excess of primary antibody. It depends a lot on what detection system you're using. My lab uses ECL Advance, which is from GE, and my normal pretty picture antibody dilution would be 1 in 50,000. I go to 1 in 25,000 if I'm doing quantitative, because I want to make sure that I have more molecules of antibody there than I have molecules of target protein on the blot. Okay, so you may have to fiddle around with that, going from 1 in 5,000, 10,000, 25,000. If you're using a less sensitive method, you're going to have to use a lot more antibody. So you also want to keep the concentration of secondary fairly well matched to the concentration of primary there. For getting nice pictures, you can even go to colorimetric assays. If you want to do quantitative, though, you've got to have some kind of imager. For chemiluminescent detection, of course, you can always use X-ray film and scan the films later. We use a CCD imager. We have 3 of them now, an old Fluoresce Max that's 10 years old, and a Kodak, and just a brand new Biorad VersaDoc. I'm very fond of the Biorad imagers. The software is quite easy, and the detection is quite good. So let's talk a little bit about the quantitation and how that works. Here's another blot done by one of my undergrads. Unfortunately, I can't even remember who it was now, but on the right-hand side of that blot, you have 3 standards. And on the left-hand side are a number of samples that students ran. Down the middle there, you see molecular weight standards. That's the IgG tagged standards. So that's magic mark, where you have a 20 kilodalton band here, a 30, a 40, and then bigger stuff up there. This is D1 PSBA, photosystem 2 protein, which, although its molecular weight is around 40, it runs at 28 because it's hydrophobic and it runs faster. So what do you do with this image that you've captured on your imager to get quantitative data out of it? Well, the first thing you do is you have to have software that will deal with it. We have software on the Kodak. We have software on our Biorad. Quantity 1 is what I'm going to walk you through here, because it's what we tend to use. First thing you generally have to do is sort of blow up the image to a size that you can really see it pixel by pixel. You'll notice that this image is quite pixelated. The old Biorad imager did quite a bit of binning of the pixels, which means that instead of looking at a single pixel, it's actually binning 4 by 4. So you've got actually 16 pixels appearing as 1 pixel on the screen. That makes slightly crappier looking pictures, but it's excellent for sensitivity. So if your imager allows you to bin, it will increase your sensitivity considerably. It's a way of getting around weaker signal. So first thing you do is you blow it up so that you can see it properly. Then you use some kind of contour tool to define what you consider to be a band. In this case, it's used the volume contour tool to select the area of the band. Really important here, though, almost all imagers do some kind of background subtract for you. And you have to think about what you want it to do. There's 2 basic methods. There's a local and a global background subtract. In a local background subtract, what it'll do is look at the pixel right outside of the contour that you drew. And you can see from that middle one, for instance, that's still got a bit of gray there. So it's going to subtract, for every pixel inside the contour, it's going to subtract that amount of intensity from the signal and call it background. Okay? If you were to select a region down here and call that background, that's what we call a global background subtract, and that's going to be probably more accurate on this blot because the background's really clean. If you have crappy background issues where you've got bits of gray and in and out, it's probably better to do a local background subtract, but choose your contours very, very carefully. So here you are. You've defined your bands. You've chosen your background subtract method. And then you ask the imager to give you some kind of volume analysis report. Now, in this case, it's just been for the standards. You would also select all of your samples, and then you would have all of that data, which you then plot some kind of a standard curve for your standards. This is the one that the third-year student actually did himself. So you can see that this case, the R-squared is pretty reasonable at 0.99. You can see that there's a little bit of a curve happening there. So if you had multiple standard points, what I often do is run a 4 or 5 point standard curve, and I tend to pick my points from where the samples are and try to get the most linear range. You can do a curvilinear fit if it's reasonable. Just whatever you do, if you do some kind of polynomial fit, make sure your data points are within your standard curve. Because as you know, as soon as you get out of your standard curve, polynomials will start curving down the opposite direction and doing all sorts of annoying things. So if you're going to go into a curved fit, just make sure that your data points are all in the middle of the data. You can obtain adjusted volumes for all of your samples and determine how many picomoles or femtomoles or whatever unit of protein you have. Grinding in liquid nitrogen is not enough to break open most of the cells. We found that we got a much higher yield of extracted protein if we sonicated. We're in the process of testing some new bead beaters. We've got 2 of them coming this month. About 8 years ago, we tested a number of, the ones that will do 24 samples at a time or something. And at that time, we couldn't find one that worked anywhere near as well as sonication. But I'm hopeful. I know there's a company at this show that's got a bead beater of some kind. We're going to be testing that out in a couple weeks. And I have another one that's coming from France that I'm going to be testing out. DC, as in AC/DC. Yeah. And it actually stands for detergent compatible. But the Biorad DC assay is a very robust assay that deals with detergent, and it comes with a choice of standards, and I tend to like the BGG standard because it's a mixture of proteins. It also comes with BSA standard, but BSA is quite a strange amino acid composition and doesn't always give you a very accurate representation of the total protein in your sample. So what we would normally do is measure total protein and load based on total protein. I've used BCA and I don't like it. It didn't generate as linear a standard curve for my samples as the Biorad DC assay did. I tested out pretty much everything I could get my paws on about 5 years ago. I've been doing some testing lately with quantum dots, which are also proving quite good. You do have to use an awful lot more antibody, though. I'm using them at 1 in 1,000 rather than 1 in 50,000. Which is great if you're trying to sell antibodies because you use 50 times more. So everyone should really switch to quantum dots. No, I can't say that because I'm too stingy in the lab, but it is a very, very good system for having a large linear range for quantitation. As I said, all of the extraction buffers that we use do have at least 2% SDS in them. If I've got a particularly fatty tissue, I'm going to use 2x sample buffer, so it's actually got twice the SDS in it. I've always had good solubilization. I mean, PSBA is a hugely hydrophobic protein, and we get complete extraction. What I see left behind is starch granules, usually for plant tissue, though. I do the protein assay after extracting an SDS. So that's why I use the detergent compatible protein assay. That Biorad DC was a Lowry, which is detergent compatible, I think up to 8% SDS. Yeah. And we've actually tested a number of the extraction methods and number of sonications and whatnot. So we'll follow total protein extraction versus soluble protein and membrane-bound protein because we look at both. And what you find is the more sonication rounds you do, the more total protein you get out. But after about 3 rounds of sonication, you start to see fragments. So if you were to follow something like Rubisco, RBCL or something, it will go up until about 3 rounds of sonication, then you start to see fragments. Something like PSBA, which is hydrophobic, you really need the 3 rounds of sonication to get it out. And again, though, you will start to see fragments. So you just have to find that balance point. And what we often do, if we have a new and strange species, some kind of dinoflagellate or a diatom, is after every sonication, we take an aliquot and we do protein assay and we load it on a gel to see with specific antibodies which ones have which number of cycles of sonication have led to the maximum extraction, minimum breakdown. But it's always a balance. I hate it. I don't think it's quantitative because to me, if you've put on something harsh enough to take the antibody off, and now you're going to assume that all of the protein that was there in the first place stayed there, I don't do it. I would rather explore multiplexing possibilities with a good imager than strip and reprobe. So I'm trying to develop some Q-dot labeled primaries now where I can label 2 or 3 up. In my ideal world, I'd have one for photosystem 1, one for photosystem 2, and one for Rubisco that I could pop on at the same time and have it detect it at the same time. I've got one for Rubisco labeled primary, but still working on the other ones. Big protein's tricky, but I've had really good success with vitellogenin. Okay, that's completely irrelevant for plants, but if you're looking at the sex of a sturgeon, it's incredibly important. But so it's 170 kilodaltons, and but this one's not membrane; it's soluble. But I have looked at large membrane as well. Low percentage gel, of course, important, so you can get it out. Long transfer time. But even in this system, I wouldn't go over 100 minutes of transfer with that system. I have never seen the 250 kilodalton marker stay in the gel on that system with 1 gel in the box. Don't do 2. The top gel always looks crappier in that system than the bottom gel. But 1 gel for about 100 minutes, and I can't see you're going to leave any protein behind on that system. Fuzzy is diffusion, which means you're getting too warm. That system there, I've never known it to heat up. You have to have quite a bit of water around the transfer cassette so that it doesn't heat up. But keep it cold and don't do it for too long. All of the protocols are on the Agricera website, and most of the antibodies have an image of a blot that goes with them. If it's one that I was involved with, it's probably me or Natalie or my Renee, who's downstairs at the exhibition, who did the blot. So almost all the antibodies have images with them.